Hello, hello. This is Ben Norton, and you are listening to or watching Moderate Rebels. This is the part 2 of a talk that I gave. I talked about the fake left and the history of CIA astroturfing, the CIA cultural Cold War, and how the US national security state created a whole massive infrastructure with billions of dollars from billionaire oligarch capitalists on Wall Street in order to astroturf these fake left groups that were, yes, maybe anti-racist and feminist and supported LGBTQ rights, often in a superficial way, but at the same time supported imperialism and were deeply anti-communist and increasingly supported neoliberal economics. So go back to part 1 to understand a lot of that history. Part 2 here is the Q&A, but it was a very productive Q&A, and I think people would like listening to it. I talk about a lot of the anti-China propaganda. I respond to some of those talking points because in the new Cold War, the Cold War 2.0, right, the fake left has become very prominent and has played a key role, just as in the first Cold War, the fake left, astroturfed by the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the CIA and these other institutions. That fake left played a very important role in supporting US imperialist aggression against Korea, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia, against the Soviet Union, supporting the covert war in Afghanistan, supporting operations against Cuba, supporting coups against communists and socialist forces around the global south, from Indonesia to the Congo to Central America and Nicaragua and El Salvador. There's so many examples. And the fake left, the useful idiots, the Cold War left, played a role in helping to justify that in the first Cold War, and similarly in the new Cold War, they're going to play another key role. And then, of course, a lot of people have been talking about it. You've probably seen that the CIA released an intersectional imperialist video of a Latina woman talking about why she's an intersectional imperialist. It was joined by a series of similar videos, including a gay man from the southern United States, and including a black woman and a blind woman talking about why the CIA is such a great agency that supports, intersectionalism and all these progressive policies. Of course, part of that is there's a recruitment ads aimed at young progressive college students who are the main base at Ivy League universities of the CIA recruitment. But also it reflects the new kind of the new fake left, the new cultural Cold War, and how the same apparatus that was created during the first Cold War, that was funding the fake left and bolstering it and spreading its ideology, has done the same thing during the new Cold War. So without further ado, here is part 2 of the discussion on the U.S. national security state and the CIA, covert operations and counterinsurgency, and the construction of a fake pro-imperialist left.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
Rebels.
Thanks a million, Ben. That was a really great talk, very articulate, very detailed, and very thorough. Something I'd really like to see in the future that we should definitely work on in the CYM is an equally detailed kind of investigation and breakdown of the NGO system in Ireland, because it is heavily government funded, and it does also draw a huge amount of funding from the EU, which plays an inevitable role in kind of, shaping and making sure of the limitations of the Irish political scene. And as you mentioned extensively in your talk, the fake left. So if you're okay to take questions now, I'm just going to start going around with the hands.
Yeah, sure. I just want to say a big thanks as well, just for coming out to talk to us today. I'm a really, really big fan of the work you guys do with the Grey Zone, so it's just a real honour to have you come out and talk to us. So thank you. But my question, I actually wrote it down because I was afraid I'd forget it. My question is actually on political stability at home in the United States. And could you just comment on that, especially after Trump? Because it seems that the topic we're talking about, US imperialism, is now actually coming home, and it's influencing not just the rise of anti-imperialism, but the rise of far-right groups. And it's something that the Democratic Party appears unable to handle. And by continuing to scapegoat Trump, they're only kind of like reinforcing support for his ideas. So clearly he was too chaotic, but it seems he isn't going away, and the establishment fears that. And even though both support imperialism, can you see how this phenomenon will play out, where the US wants to continue its imperialist policies abroad, but it's also trying to juggle this kind of like instability developing at home, and this in turn leading to the development of, let's say, kind of more draconian measures where you have the rise of the tech companies and suppression. So just how do you see this phenomenon playing out at home, in particular, with the rise of Trump? That's it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great question. Of course, I could spend forever talking about this, but I'll keep it very short. I think there are a lot of parallels in the situation in Western Europe, especially France, because what you're seeing is the emergence of this extreme, like you can say far right, this very right-wing conservative nationalism. So you could look at Marine Le Pen as an example, that at least for opportunistic reasons, of course, they're often lying, but for opportunistic reasons, will criticize multilateral international institutions, like in her case, the European Union and even NATO. Now, if she were to become the president, I highly doubt she would leave NATO and the European Union. It's just rhetoric for her base. We, of course, saw that a lot of the far-right movements around Western Europe have often claimed to be Eurosceptic, and then they come into power, and they're some of the most pro-European Union of all of the politicians, right? Because the European Union is a big bankers cartel that supports imperialism, that recognized Juan Guaido at first, that supports Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's totally imperialist, and it's totally racist. This idea spread by like the fake left in Western Europe that the European Union is like some enlightened anti-racist feminist institution, which is, I mean, that's just hilarious. But anyway, so what we see is that in the United States, there's something similar. And Donald Trump is very similar to a kind of Marine Le Pen-like figure, right? Where when he was elected, he campaigned claiming falsely that he was going to end U.S. wars, that he was going to push back against these regime change operations. Now, it is true that he didn't begin a totally new military war, and to be honest, if Hillary Clinton had been president, she very likely would have invaded Syria. I mean, the U.S. already has several hundred, if not thousands, of troops militarily occupying the northeast chunk of Syria, 1/3 of Syrian territory, and the current head of the Pentagon desk for Joe Biden's administration, her name, Dana Stroll is her name. She boasted that the U.S. military owns, in her term, 1/3 of Syrian territory, in which what she referred to as its, quote, economic powerhouse, which includes the majority of its hydrocarbons, including oil and gas, and also the majority of its wheat. So they're starving the Syrian government of both oil and wheat. And that strategy began under Obama, but it did continue under Trump. And of course, Trump went on TV and he gave a speech saying that we're staying to steal their oil. He said it openly. And it's not just that U.S. companies want the oil. Of course they want the oil, but it's also about starving the Syrian government, the central government that controls the majority of the country, of revenue so it can't rebuild. That's explicitly the policy of the Biden administration, is they were trying to prevent rebuilding in Syria, which is totally just a crime against humanity. It's totally so just sadistic. But anyway, to be fair, if Hillary Clinton had been president, I think she would have gone further and probably militarily invaded Syria, and who knows what else. She was the architect of the war in Libya, an extreme war hawk. But at the same time, obviously Trump lied, and Trump didn't start a new conventional military war, but he drastically expanded the new Cold War in China, beginning this trade war, which has only continued under Biden. He drastically expanded sanctions on Russia, which is hilarious because all like the neoliberal democratic intelligentsia were convinced that he was a puppet of Putin, a totally absurd conspiracy that was pushed by the U.S. intelligence agencies through the media. The CIA feeding all these scoops, claiming, for instance, that Russia was giving bounties to Taliban militants in Afghanistan to kill U.S. troops, which was totally false. And that was used to prevent Trump from withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. And now they admit that it was false. Just one example of how the CIA launders fake news and disinformation through its assets in the media at the New York Times and the Washington Post. They publish it, and then U.S. politicians, including Democrats and neoconservative Republicans, used that to vote. For instance, they voted in the House of Representatives against Trump's withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So, I mean, that's an example of how that works. But we did see that Trump expanded the war in Syria with the military occupation. And, of course, Trump started the vicious coup attempt in Venezuela and the blockade of Venezuela. Now, that, like with all of these policies, it had its seeds under the Obama administration. In 2015, the Obama administration insanely declared Venezuela to be a so-called threat to U.S. national security, which is hilarious. And every year since then, the Trump administration and now the Biden administration has renewed this executive order coming directly from the White House claiming that Venezuela is a, quote, extraordinary and unusual threat to the national security of the United States. Insane, but that's what they use to justify the sanctions. Because if a country is not a supposed national security threat to the United States, then the president can't just impose sanctions without approval from Congress. But if the president imposes an executive order claiming a country is a national security threat, they can sign an executive order without having to go through Congress imposing sanctions. And the U.S. has done that to countries representing between 1/3 and 1/4 of global population. So under Trump, he drastically expanded that. The strategy began under George Bush and then under Obama. Of course, there have been countries like North Korea, the DPRK, and like Iran that have been under sanctions for decades. And of course, Iraq in the 1990s was under genocidal sanctions that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children, which famously the U.S. Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, defended in a 60 Minutes interview, saying that she thought the price was worth it. So there's historical echoes, but after the 9/11 attacks and George Bush Jr., they began imposing more sanctions. He declares the so-called axis of evil. And then under Obama, sanctions start rising. And you can see there's graphs showing the number of U.S. sanctions. And it just skyrocketed under Trump to a whole new level. So what Trump did is instead of having a military conventional war, he just expanded economic war and sanctions and trade war. So, of course, that part of his strategy did not, the U.S. capitalist class is not necessarily against that. But, of course, Trump was very bad for the U.S. empire. Trump was a horrible symbol as the face of the U.S. empire. Trump encouraged conflict between the United States and Western Europe, including within NATO, which really terrified the people in the U.S. national security state, the unelected bureaucrats who make policy in the Pentagon and the State Department, which is the majority of the U.S. state, which is also known as the national security state or the deep state. I mean, every country has a deep state. It's the state, right? Not every bureaucrat is elected. You know, when there's a new president or prime minister, not every member of the foreign ministry and the defense ministry is changed, right? Like there's a continuity that continues throughout every administration. So similarly, a lot of people in the national security state they were very concerned by how unstable the U.S. was under Trump, how he would do these crazy policies without a moment's notice, and then he would just a week later have a totally 180 on his policy. So he says he wants to withdraw troops from Syria, and then he says, oh, I was convinced to leave the troops in Syria to steal the oil. And there's so much of that. So he was very unstable. He was an unstable, bad custodian for U.S. imperialism. And that scared parts of the U.S. capitalist class and parts of the U.S. state. And they decided that they're going to try to cultivate people like Joe Biden, who functionally, his mental health is very weak. It's very low. He is not making most of his policies. What we're seeing now in the United States is rule by the national security state through like the intelligentsia and these apparatchiks in the Democratic elite, capital D Democratic elite, with their funders from, of course, Wall Street, Big Pharma, the military-industrial complex. More than ever, I mean, that's how every government is, of course. Even if Bernie Sanders somehow managed to win the election, I honestly think he would be able to accomplish very little because of all of those structural impediments, because the United States is not a democracy, just like Britain is not a democracy, as we saw with Jeremy Corbyn, how the British national security state and the intelligence services there undermined his candidacy and spread fake news and disinformation and propaganda to undermine the Labour Party. And of course, Keir Starmer is a creature of the British national security state who was, as a prosecutor, worked closely with intelligence and has very strange, very shady ties to MI5 and MI6, as Matt Kennard has reported, the great British journalist. And I would recommend looking into Matt Kennard's work on that. But anyway, the point is that any government that comes in a bourgeois democracy, the president or prime minister will have so many institutional impediments to preventing them from doing what they want. This is what led to a functional soft coup against a progressive Labour Party leader in Australia. Gough Whitlam, I think is his name. And the Australian journalist John Pilger has written about this. There was a kind of soft coup backed by the US and the British against Gough Whitlam because he wanted to withdraw from NATO and he was anti-neoliberal and he wanted better relations with the Eastern Bloc. So anyway, what happens now is that the middleman is basically removed. Biden is making very little policy, and those unelected bureaucrats are making basically all of the policy. And Antony Blinken, I would go on a limb and say Antony Blinken has more power than Joe Biden. Because Joe Biden's mental health is so weak, he can barely give a functioning speech without making some horrible faux pas. Antony Blinken is driving a lot of foreign policy. Antony Blinken in the Joe Biden, in the Obama administration, Antony Blinken and in the State Department played a key role in the war in Libya, the war in Syria, in the war in Yemen, by the way. And he's deeply ideologically supportive of Israeli apartheid. And he's a hardcore imperialist. But also, he's different from Mike Pompeo. And this gets me finally to answer the last part of this answer to your question about the future. Of course, I can't predict where it's going, but what we're seeing is the emergence of what people are jokingly, but not really that jokingly, calling intersectional imperialism. Today I was talking about the fake left.
I feel like I'm being rude now and interrupting you, but I was just going to ask before I go as well, because I have to head off. What did you think of that CIA ad that was just released? Because a few of us were laughing at it, and it just seemed like something the right would actually use as a parody of the left, and the left is looking at it just being like, is this a fucking joke? Like, because you know the CIA's history of like torture, murder, kidnappings, assassinations, and then you have this one talking about like her anxiety disorder, and it's just like, what is this fucking ad? So I just wanted to get a quick comment from you on that as well, and just thanks again, basically.
No, absolutely. I mean, this fits in perfectly to everything we've been talking about today, right? The cultural Cold War apparatus, Gloria Steinem, the fake left, and how the CIA cultivated it. And by the way, I'm an American, so I'm focusing on the CIA's element, but you can bet that MI6 and other Western European intelligence agencies have done something very similar, you know, with the kind of Western European Euro-communism, pro-European Union, pro-imperialist, social democratic forces, and like the Labour Party and the French Socialist Party. Of course, there's so much of that when it comes to the funding from Western European governments, and I don't really know that much about it, but I know about the CIA's angle. And anyway, so that ad, when I saw that CIA ad, I thought people they don't understand actually. They're missing the main thrust of that ad. Of course, the right wing was making fun of it, but for me, that CIA ad is actually it's not they're not trying to trick people. It's reflecting the new counterinsurgency strategy against the global left. And it's not new. It's the same strategy that they used during the first Cold War and that they're now using in the new Cold War. It's Gloria Steinem, the godmother of American feminism, was a CIA agent. And she gave a speech, go to YouTube, look it up. She gave a speech talking about how progressive, she said, the CIA was, and how they all wanted the same things as her, women's rights and civil rights, etc. The idea that the CIA is like some like mouth-foaming like Nazi agency. No, as I was saying earlier, the CIA is capitalism's invisible army. It is the organized crime arm of financial capital. It has its origins in Wall Street with Wall Street lawyers. And if you look at finance capital is not socially conservative. This gets back at a misunderstanding of capitalism. Capitalism, what's the famous quote? Capitalism breaks down all Chinese walls or something. The point is that actually a lot of fascists, they are kind of course, capitalist. They're not socialist. They're kind of capitalist, but a lot of them they're actually kind of more feudal if you think about it. Fascism is kind of like neo-feudalism, right? Because the thing about capitalism is that it forces feudal relations to break down, and women, for instance, are forced out of the homes where the fascists want them to stay raising the nuclear family, and they're forced into the workplace. So the nuclear family is broken down by capitalism, and fascists complain about how the nuclear family is falling apart, and they blame the socialists and the globalists or whatever. No, it's actually capitalism in many ways that's breaking down the nuclear family, because both of the parents have to work. There's no time for family, like having time with your family and having dinner together. Everyone's working and whatever. That's capitalism, right? Or capitalism forces people out of the countryside and their traditional feudal relations and their communal, old school, like pre-capitalist relations, and like in case of indigenous communities, and forces them into the cities where they often live in like these horrible slums. That's capitalism, right? So the idea that like the CIA is like the CIA understands that these are weapons that they can help better support imperialism and capitalism, which is why in some ways the Democratic Party is, I'm not in any way trying to exculpate the Republican Party, which is a horrible, honestly kind of a neo-feudal party, but in some ways the Democratic Party has become the most explicitly pro-imperialist party. Of course, the Republican Party supports all of these wars and all of this, but now what we're seeing is that the new hegemonic ideology of imperialism is, well, the way they used to justify it is similar to the old white man's burden, but I call it the inverted white man's burden, right? Now it's the enlightened, civilized capitalists who are trying to educate the barbaric hordes in the global south who are racists and misogynists and anti-abortion and against LGBTQ people, right? So they, just as in the white man's burden, the European colonialists could use use the argument of civilizational, missions and supremacy and being more sophisticated to justify their colonial conquest. Now, the intersectional imperialists can say, we're spreading women's rights in Afghanistan. We're spreading LGBTQ rights in Palestine. The Israeli regime, the colonial apartheid regime, is supporting women's rights. Look, there are women in the Israeli military. There are LGBTQ people in the Israeli military. There aren't any Israeli. No, I mean and they look at Palestine. They say, look, where are the LGBTQ people in Hamas? That's the propaganda they use. Of course, it's called pinkwashing. It's not new necessarily, but that has become the kind of new hegemonic ideology of imperialism. And that CIA ad is just boasting it. It's broadcasting it to the entire world, and of course, it's also trying to recruit a whole new generation of young college students who are going to elite colleges. And of course, the CIA, as I said, it has its origins with Wall Street bankers. Alan Dulles was a Wall Street banker, and these big foundations I talked about, who are not supporting for the most part, conservative groups. They're supporting the fake left, the pro-imperialist, liberal groups, the social chauvinist groups, the Cold War social democrats, and that CIA ad is just further confirmation of it. So finally, what do I see going further? I think that we're going to see that in the US and in Western Europe, politics barely even exist anymore in terms of the actual material relations of society, in terms of class conflict. That's all gone, and it's all dumb cultural politics. So it becomes whether or not you support or oppose immigration. I mean, I of course support rights for immigrants, but like now in Europe, like every left-wing party is being destroyed internally on whether or not they support open borders or are opposed to open borders. And as we see like with the Die Linke party, the left party in Germany, or now in the United States, like it's all about intersectional imperialism, and the Democrats weaponized a superficial understanding of identity politics to destroy the Bernie Sanders movement, claiming that they were all brocialists and racists and sexists. And that what that does is it removes class entirely from politics. I'm not saying that anti-racism is not important. It's important. I'm not saying that feminism is not important. It's important, but it removes class totally from politics, and everything becomes about the culture war. So the Democratic Party supports feminism in a superficial neoliberal way, and anti-racism in a superficial neoliberal way. And the Republicans support white nationalism and the idea of like the nuclear family, the nuclear family led by the patriarchal man and all this stuff. And then they have a total agreement on neoliberal politics. And then what happens is that this whole thing of so-called globalism, which is a very dangerous term, which we should absolutely oppose, it's called imperialism. Globalism doesn't exist. It's called imperialism, but the right wing has tried to co-opt the idea of imperialism by removing class from it and removing capitalism from it. Imperialism, going back to Lenin, it's the highest stage of capitalism. It's about finance capital's control of the world. When the imperial powers carved up the entire world, then what happened is that, and when feudal relations were overthrown and countries were developed through capitalism, imperialism became the high stage of capitalism in which the capitalist countries fully developed in the highest stage of capitalism, unlike countries in the global south which are still developing. So that's why they're definitionally not imperialist, because they haven't even developed capitalism necessarily. They're still partially feudal. Whereas the imperialist powers, through the power of finance capital and through the power of the large corporate conglomerates that control their politics, they are the ones dominating the planet, right? And that is what imperialism looks like. And all of these corporations now are totally on board with exploiting superficial identity politics. So Nike had a Black Lives Matter ad, and all of these ads were supporting like Me Too, and they claim to be feminists and stuff. And they're doing like these corporate sponsored diversity trainings where like some person gets paid like $5,000 to tell you to check your privilege or whatever. Like, this is the future of liberalism and of the capitalist class. Meanwhile, this whole idea of globalism removes class and removes capital and removes capitalism from the idea of imperialism and makes it all about like whether or not you support politics within your borders, which is, they're idiots. There's no such thing as like globalism versus nationalism. That's so dumb, because as we saw with Donald Trump, or as we see with the far right in Europe, they claim to be against globalism and they end up supporting imperialism because they don't understand ideologically how imperialism is deeply embedded into the political economic system. So going forward, I think it's further intensification of what we've seen over the past 10 years. The same thing in Europe, a continued rise of a fascistic far right that totally makes everything about culture and not class. It's all about immigration against the evil Muslims, against non-white people, and Judeo-Christian civilization, and the nuclear family. And on the other side, it's just doubling down on intersectional imperialism, and how in order to be a true progressive, you have to support NATO and war with China and Russia because they're supposedly evil, authoritarian, red-brown regimes, and you have to support Wall Street, and specifically big tech, by the way, which I didn't even talk about, Silicon Valley. That's the future. And the idea that the nationalist right is saying in the U.S. and Europe that they're in the new working class party is totally absurd, just as ridiculous. The National Front is not going to ever be a working class party. The U.S. Republican Party is never going to be a working class party. What they're going to be eventually is a fascist party, and this is what fascism was. It was a misdirected, failed revolution. That's always what fascism was, claiming to act on behalf of the working class when actually removing class from politics and making everything about culture, while the liberal imperialists just continue destroying the entire planet.
So, George Avery, take it away.
You were just saying there, Ben, and thanks for the talk. I just gotta say, I agree with most of what you say, but overall it was, I found some things you said quite one-sided. For example, you were talking about China's role in developing South America, and you live in Nicaragua yourself, so I'm sure you've heard about the canal, how Daniel Ortega's government dished out 50 billion for the Chinese company HKND to build a canal through indigenous land. But that's been in the works for quite some time, and some people have been saying that they've run away with the money, but due to Nicaragua's corporate laws, Daniel Ortega hasn't put his foot down. I mean, for example, you can't really talk about China's role in helping South Americans when, for example, recently this year in Peru, remember they built the copper mining plant and factory in Peru. They had to evict over 3,000 indigenous peasants who were wailed upon with, fucking tear gas and batons and everything. Most of those, actually, if you check where the Peruvian police get their stuff, a lot of those are actually manufactured in China too. And then you've also got in a lot of the pink tide countries, for example, Bolivia, China bought huge numbers of Bolivian lithium land with loads of lithium to buy. I mean, loads of Bolivia's lithium has been bought up by China. I think over half of it was bought under the last presidency of Morales, who is now back in office. I mean, not just in South America. I mean, we've also got, for example, in Myanmar, you brought up Myanmar near the end there, China, who have been remarkably silent on the right-wing military dictatorship there, also extract oil from Myanmar through an undersea pipeline. And you've also got in the Philippines, where China has occupied the massive chunk of the Filipino coast and is now building artificial islands for naval bases there. And they also fund and sell weapons to the Filipino government to the extent that Duterte, the Filipino president, massive anti-communist who murders leftist activists, said that if the army stopped supporting him tomorrow, he'd stay in power because of the Chinese. And also, you seem to, with the Mexican situation, which you spoke of extensively, and again, I agree with most of what you're saying. It's just, I feel like this is a bit one-sided because, for example, with Mexicans, you haven't mentioned that the progressive president of Mexico is actually allowing and funding paramilitary groups in the Chiapas to murder anarchist Zapatistas. And also there is indeed, recently there was that horrific massacre in Bangladesh where workers striking against a Chinese coal plant were shot into in the crowd and 5 were killed. I think that about covers it. Oh yeah, another thing, there's also the Chinese labor rights as well. I mean, yeah, sure, I do agree that a lot of these things are exaggerated about China, but Chinese labor law is still bad. It's not good. For example, according to Chinese labor law, there's actually the trade unions of enterprises and the administration of enterprises shall have equal legal status, yeah, according to Chinese labor law, which means that employers and employees are valued basically equally, yeah, by the sole Chinese trade union, the ACFTU. So, which the trade union is supposed to represent the workers, but in Chinese labor law, it's supposed to represent equally workers and employers, which is not very good labor law practice. So I just think the whole story hasn't really been told there. And I'd like your reaction to those comments, all in good faith. And thank you for the talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Well, no, thank you for the good faith comments. I appreciate that. We should be able to talk about this stuff. A few things. I mean, first of all, as I said, China is not some workers' paradise. And actually, it's not even, there's not nearly as much workers' protection as there was in the Soviet Union. So I'm certainly not pretending like it's some great, perfect country, but we should also understand that a lot of this stuff is either false or greatly distorted and exaggerated. So I'll just try to go through a few of the examples just briefly here that you mentioned. In the case of Nicaragua, the canal is a great example. One of the main reasons for the US-backed very violent coup attempt that began in April of 2018, in which hundreds of Sandinistas were killed, in which I have friends who they had their friends or loved ones shot. And I interviewed a guy whose brother and his father were both killed, and then their bodies were set on fire and thrown in garbage for being Sandinistas. I mean, these are very similar to the terrorist death squads that we saw in the 1980s. One of the main reasons for that coup attempt was to stop the construction of another canal. If Nicaragua builds a canal, it would change global commerce. It would be extremely important. And this is something that would not only be great for Central America, which is one of the poorest regions in the entire world, but also for other countries in the global south that want to prevent. I mean, the Panama Canal was essentially created by the US empire as a kind of colony. Panama was broken off of Colombia and created as a kind of US protectorate, and the US knew that it would have kind of de facto control over it. And a huge percentage of global trade relies on the Panama Canal. The point of building an alternative canal through a partnership of Nicaragua and China is to prevent the U.S. financial chokehold on the global, the U.S. economic chokehold on the global trade system, which would be extremely important. And as for indigenous communities in Nicaragua, you can't speak about indigenous communities as some kind of homogenous entity, because there are indigenous communities in Nicaragua that support and vote with the Sandinista Front, and who elected indigenous leaders in local communities who strongly supported the building of the canal, because they knew that if a canal is built, then it's going to very rapidly help develop their regions, these poor rural regions in Nicaragua, which is still very much an underdeveloped and poor country. So the idea that the government is just building it through indigenous land without care, I mean, that is insane propaganda. It is completely false. Now, of course, there are contradictions. If you're a poor country and you want to develop your country, you're going to have to do some environmental damage. That's the reality. But these poor countries in the global south, like Latin America, are responsible for a very tiny percentage of global carbon emissions. They have a very small carbon footprint. Nicaragua actually has one of the smallest carbon footprints in the entire world. It is a small country, but they invest very heavily in green programs and climate change reduction programs. They very heavily value the environment, but you have to be able to balance that with development. And I want to say this from personal experience. I highly recommend people coming to visit countries in the global south, especially Latin America, and seeing the poverty that some people live in. I mean, it is unimaginable to people living in the global north and the imperial core. They cannot imagine. And the incredible strides of the Sandinista government. That's not to say the Sandinista government is perfect. It has also made a lot of compromises, including with capital here. They made a lot of compromises, especially since they came back into power in 2007, because they had to go through bourgeois democratic elections, just like the Chavistas in Venezuela. It's not Cuba. They weren't able to totally expropriate the capitalist class. But at the same time, they've made huge strides in poverty reduction. I mean, during the neoliberal era in the 1990s, there were so many people living in poverty, the majority of Nicaraguans. There were illiteracy rates were rising. And by the way, there were so many communities that did not have running water, yet alone electricity. And now the 99% of people in Nicaragua have access to electricity and running water. And also there's a program to provide housing and roofs for people. So, I mean, the idea that they're just like allowing a Chinese state-owned company just to like build a canal without any regard is pretty absurd propaganda. Okay, so going through to, you mentioned Bolivia. I mean, this is another classic example. Look, Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in Latin America. Nicaragua is the poorest country in Latin America and the Caribbean after Haiti. Bolivia is the next poorest. Bolivia is a very poor country, and they don't have the technological expertise and the human capital to be able to develop a lot of these programs, these ambitious infrastructure programs that the Movement Towards Socialism Party has wanted to implement. I should stress this is called the Movement Towards Socialism Party, because they understand that you can't build socialism in a poor, underdeveloped country. If you go back to Orthodox Marxism, socialism is part of a process, it's part of the stage, but you can't develop without having industrial capitalist development first. And a lot of these very poor countries, they don't even have technological infrastructure in terms of water and electricity, yet alone the ability to develop socialism. In the case of the Movement Towards Socialism Party of Bolivia, Evo Morales certainly had to make compromises. And by the way, a lot of the same propaganda weaponizing indigenous communities against Evo Morales was used to support the coup against him and propaganda against Evo Morales. This is the first ever indigenous president in modern Bolivian history, and there was all this propaganda claiming that he lost the support of the indigenous community and all this propaganda. Absolutely absurd. Now, it's not to say that every single indigenous person supports these governments. I mean, there's this kind of infantilization of indigenous people in the global north, as if all indigenous people are like, they like hug the trees and they love Mother Earth. No, there are right-wing capitalists in indigenous communities, especially in Ecuador. There's a very strong bourgeoisie in the indigenous communities. And when we say indigenous communities, there are many indigenous peoples, some of whom support, in the case of Ecuador, the progressive Correísta movement, and in the case of Bolivia, some of whom support, the majority of whom support the movement towards socialism party. But there are right-wingers, just as like in the United States, there are black Republicans and black right-wingers. And so there are Irish who supported British colonialism. I mean, there's all these contradictions, right? So the point is that in the case of Bolivia, yes, there were some indigenous communities that were critical of the government because of its infrastructure programs, but you can't build roads and you can't use your natural resources to fund social programs without destroying the environment to some degree. The thing is, in the global north, most of these countries have already destroyed the environment. They already have roads and infrastructure. So it's easy to be against new infrastructure projects there, but it's very different in the global south, in these very poor countries, especially countries that want to use their natural resources to benefit the majority and to fund social programs. And in the case of lithium, Bolivia recognized that they have all of this lithium they can use to fund universal healthcare, universal education, and infrastructure projects, but they don't have the technological expertise and the ability to use it. So they relied on foreign countries and foreign companies to help them do that. It wasn't just Chinese state-owned companies which did help them develop the lithium in agreements with the with the Bolivian government. These aren't. It's not like Bolivia. What the neoliberal governments do is they allow foreign capital to exploit their natural resources. The state has nothing to do with it, and then the foreign capital just extracts that wealth, and that wealth does not go to benefit the indigenous population and the local people. What these governments do under the progressive governments in Latin America, like in Bolivia and Ecuador under Rafael Correa also had huge infrastructure projects with Chinese state-owned companies. In the case of both, the Chinese companies help them use their natural resources, build infrastructure, and develop. And of course, I mean, the Chinese companies, they have contracts, they do take money in return for it, but a lot of that revenue goes to supporting Bolivian and Ecuadorian social programs, or in the case of Venezuela, which has a lot of programs with China. Look, we have to be realistic. If you're a poor country in the global south without human capital, it's easy to say, we're just going to use our oil or use our lithium to develop our country. How do you get it out of the ground? How do you refine it? How do you get it into the international market? How do you build technology with it? These are all very capital-intensive projects. It's much easier said than done. By the way, I should mention, who helped Bolivia build some of their infrastructure as well? It was Austrian companies, German companies. I mean, these companies often have much worse contracts than the Chinese state-owned companies, which are often very favorable contracts to the governments in Latin America. I'm not saying they're doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. Of course, they're taking money in return for it. But the point is that China has this project, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is based on mutual development, based on the mutual interest of countries. So whereas the World Bank and the IMF are all about extraction of capital and natural resources from these countries and exploitation of their labor that goes in one direction to the imperial core, what China has done through these projects and through the Belt and Road Initiative is state-owned companies make this money and they use it for the Chinese government. And they do make money off of it, of course, but at the same time, these governments in Latin America, you mentioned Myanmar, it was the Myanmar government that supported, and not just the military, by the way, it was also the democratically elected government under the National League for Democracy, under Aung San Suu Kyi, who supported Belt and Road Initiative development projects. That was one of the main reasons that Western governments that had cultivated the rise of Aung San Suu Kyi and who her entire party apparatus, the NLD, has been cultivated over decades and funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. They supported her rise because they thought that she would just go against China. But the reality is that if you're a neighbor of China and you do the vast majority of your trade with China, you can't just be elected and then overnight end relations with China. That's an insane policy. But it was actually the NLD, funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, that was doing protests against these infrastructure projects that would help create more electricity for rural areas in Myanmar, including creation of a massive super dam that was being built in Myanmar through a government contract with the Chinese state-owned companies. WikiLeaks cables show that the U.S. Embassy was encouraging protests against that, even though they knew the U.S. Embassy acknowledged that it would hurt electricity access in rural areas in Myanmar, which is a very poor country. They knew that they were taking electricity away from poor people in Myanmar, but it was part of their geopolitical strategy of preventing Myanmar from developing this infrastructure in collaboration with the Chinese state-owned company. I mean, so it's really incredible. By the way, if we're talking about Myanmar really quickly, the forces of the NLD, the National League of Democracy, and Aung San Suu Kyi are some of the most racist, anti-Rohingya, Buddhist nationalist, Buddhist supremacist forces in Burma, because the Burma is the ethnic group there, the majority ethnic group. They are some of the most racist, supremacist forces in all of Myanmar. I'm not saying that the military is some great benevolent force. The military, during the Aung San Suu Kyi government, was helping to carry out the violence against the Rohingya in collaboration with her Buddhist supremacist government. And the mass base right now for the protests, the violent protests and the ethnic insurgency against the Myanmar military dictatorship right now, the junta that overthrew the government in February, those forces are often the main forces who led the violence, the genocidal violence against the Rohingya. We've actually done a little reporting on this, and we're doing more. In fact, some of these Buddhist supremacist, fascist, paramilitary groups and gangs who were initiating the genocidal violence against the Rohingya, some of that violence was broken up by the military. I'm not saying the military is some great benevolent force, of course not. I mean, it's like with any of these conflicts, or like the Syrian military, of course there's violence on both sides, but that's how this propaganda works, is that there's violence on both sides, but the Western corporate media fixates only on the violence on one side. They fixate only on the violence of the Myanmar military junta, not talking about the armed militia groups that have taken over military bases and are launching attacks on the military and are kidnapping police forces, which has all been documented by Western government-funded pro-opposition, pro-NLD Myanmar media, by the way. So there's, and the same thing in Syria. We're supposed to believe that the Syrian military is responsible for all of the deaths, even though the reality is that it was much more like 50-50, whereas these head-shopping, fanatical Salafi jihadists who are working with the Turkish military to ethnically cleanse Kurds and to carry out genocide against the Alawite and Shia minorities and put Alawite civilians in cages, that's never acknowledged in the media, but all of the violence of the Syrian government is acknowledged. So that's how these propaganda campaigns work. And finally, on the note of China, really quickly before I pivot to another question, I just want to look at an article in a Chinese propaganda magazine, the Financial Times, the voice of the British capitalist class, which acknowledges, today they have a lot of anti-China propaganda, but they also acknowledge that in terms of debts, most of the infrastructure projects that China is doing is in countries in the global south, and it has renegotiated a lot of that debt. So developing countries have renegotiated about 50 billion of Chinese loans in the past decades, with term extensions, refinancing, and debt forgiveness the most frequent outcomes. So this is challenging the debt trap accusations. An examination of 38 Chinese debt renegotiations in 24 countries concluded Chinese leverages remains limited, with many of the renegotiations resolved in favor of the borrower. This means in favor of Ecuador, Venezuela, Myanmar, etc., parts of Africa, Zimbabwe. Debt write-offs were found in 14 cases. Have you ever heard of debt write-offs in the case of the IMF or the World Bank? No, they demand neoliberal structural adjustment if you want to write off your debt. You can't write it off, you renegotiate it. You don't actually write it all off. Deferments in 11 cases, and refinancing and debt term changes accounting for most other cases. So the point is that I would highly recommend also The Economist. There's a brilliant economist named Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson has done a lot of work. Michael-Hudson.com And Mike, here it is. I'll get it up. He's a Marxist economist who he's also done some really interesting historical work on debt and like in Jesus and all that stuff. But he has some really good stuff on China. He actually has taught in China. He's advised many governments, including the US government, the Icelandic government, the Chinese government. And he has some really interesting work. He wrote this article recently looking at China's developmental model. And I'm not saying that China, again, is some great, perfect country. There's a lot to criticize about it, as with any country. And it's not even nearly close to the same model as the Soviet Union. But there's so much propaganda, and we have to understand that, look, being brutally honest, from my interviews and my discussions with leftists in Latin America, so many people in Latin America have said, and this is a government official, they said, if it were not for financial support from China and then political support and military support for Russia, they would never have succeeded. The only reason the Bolivarian Revolution has been able to hold on with the U.S. economic blockade, this medieval blockade that has starved the Venezuelan government of 99% of its state revenue, according to the United Nations Special Rapporteur who recently visited. The only reason is because of the help of China and also to a lesser extent Russia. China continues doing economic deals and oil deals with China. Of course, China is not some benevolent country that's going to like just give free capital. They have bilateral, mutually beneficial agreements with these countries. But in Ecuador, by the way, if you listen to the speeches, especially of Delcy Rodriguez, who's the vice president, and we published an interview with Rodriguez. Also, every time she gives a speech about China, Delcy Rodriguez often speaks about how China has helped save the Bolivarian Revolution from being overthrown by these very favorable trade agreements, by forgiving loans. Again, I'm not saying that China is some great benevolent country. It has its own ulterior motives in this because it has a major ally which has huge oil reserves, and China relies on oil imports, and it knows that if China has Venezuela as one of its main allies, it won't have an oil shortage. No country, including the former Soviet Union or any socialist country or Cuba, no country ever acts in pure benevolent, solidarity with others. They always have their own foreign policy interest, but doing bilateral agreements with other countries is not the same thing as imperialism. If you have some perfect socialist country, that doesn't mean that you stop doing trade agreements with other countries. That's like you can't. I mean, this is actually ironically the same kind of people criticizing the Soviet Union for the socialism in one country policy. They suddenly criticize socialist governments for having trade agreements with other countries and not trying to develop socialism in their own country. How are poor countries like Bolivia and Ecuador and Nicaragua and Venezuela and many other countries around the global south, how are they supposed to develop their own country? It's very easy to condescend to them and say, you should just do it on your own. But you have to have access to more foreign capital. It's like, as an example of a parallel, how are you supposed to run a business? How can you create a company without access to capital? Unless you're a rich kid who inherited a bunch of money, it's almost impossible to create a business without seed funding, without beginning capital. And similarly, it's almost impossible to develop your country if you you can't run any deficits. Every country in the world that develops has to run deficits. In order to pay for those deficits, they rely on foreign capital. You could go to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, who's going to give you that money to supposedly develop your country, and then they're going to privatize your natural resources, your infrastructure. They're going to cut labor programs and protections for your workers, and they're going to do a host of other programs. Believe it or not, one of the main reasons a lot of these countries in the global south have done these trade agreements with China is because the Chinese banks, the state-owned banks, don't require you to do structural adjustment programs like the IMF and the World Bank. So they actually allow you to develop. The reality is that one of the main reasons the pink tide in Latin America was allowed to be as strong as it was is because of help. Not like, I'm not saying that they're all puppets of China. That's like the right-wing talking point. But because of help, financial help from China. China helped the Venezuelans, the Ecuadorians, the Bolivians, and other countries. So that's the reality. China's not some perfect country, but especially now in the Cold War, we have to realize how much propaganda there is about China. And to counter some of that, I would recommend looking into the work of the economist Michael Hudson.
So it's just on the you mentioned like the U.S. occupation in northeastern Syria, and obviously like the Kurds have been, they're the ones who kind of invited the Americans in, and I'm wondering kind of uh what your take is on that of like, because obviously they're collaborating with an imperialist force, but like you look at, for example, Ireland in 1916 collaborated with Germany to get guns, and they were an imperialist country. So I'm wondering sort of your what your take would be on that, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, well, good question, and this is a very important topic to talk about. Yeah, it's true that they did collaborate. Well, you could say collaborate. They accepted guns from Germany, and there's a long history of different imperialist powers, especially in the 18 and 1900s, of these imperialist powers supporting national liberation movements against other imperial powers. So famously, for instance, the United States helped support forces in Cuba to rise up against the Spanish colonialists in the Spanish-American War, 1898. So there is certainly a long history of that. Of course, the U.S. later colonized Cuba, so there's a major historical lesson for there. But the difference is that there's a difference between accepting weapons, as the Irish did, and allowing them to build multiple military bases in your territory and to embed their military forces within your own forces. I hope you see the distinction there. There's one difference between accepting some support to fight ISIS. And that's why at first I and a lot of people thought, okay, well, it's true they don't really have much support other than accepting support from the US military to fight ISIS. And ISIS was committing genocide against the Kurds in North Syria. So, it was understandable at first, but there was mission creep and it expanded, and now the US military has multiple bases in Syria. The US military has claimed that it's never going to close those bases in Syria. And in fact, a US military general boasted to Reuters in an article in Reuters that the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the rebranding of the People's Protection Units, the YPG, the Kurdish majority forces, that the SDF were created at the demand of the US military, because everyone knows that the YPG has links to the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is based in southern Turkey, led by Öcalan, and is considered by Turkey and actually by the United States to be a terrorist organization. So the US pressured the YPG to create this new organization, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, and this is documented. This is a confirmed fact that the US military has boasted about. And now the SDF has continued allowing the US military not only to occupy 1/3 of Syrian territory, which again, as the head of the Biden Pentagon's Middle East desk boasted, the US owns 1/3 of Syria, as she put it, including its economic powerhouse. But they're also allowing the US to starve the Syrian government of oil revenue and of wheat, which has caused a bread shortage in Syria. And of course, in the Middle East, people eat a lot of bread. It's a staple of the cuisine there. So there's a massive shortage of oil, of fuel, and of wheat in Syria. So while it might be understandable at first that the YPG took support from the US to fight ISIS, they went well above and beyond that. And now, not only that, there was recently an article in the Military Times, or the US Air Force Times, which is a US military magazine, about how the US military has been training the SDF forces to call in airstrikes without US forces with them, by the way. So this is the first time that a non-state actor has ever been given the authority to call in US airstrikes without the presence, the immediate presence of US troops. I mean, absolutely incredible. And I think there's no other, you can't make any other conclusion other than that the YPG SDF leadership absolutely sold out to US imperialism. And again, that's not to say that like the Kurdish people don't have very legitimate grievances. They certainly do, considering how Turkey is still militarily occupying, by the way, with the support of these Western powers, including the US, Turkey has been militarily occupying a huge chunk of northern Syria, including Idlib, which is controlled partially by Syria and the fake so-called Syrian National Army, the SNA, which is all of like the mercenary Salafi jihadist death squads who had their origins in the fake Free Syrian Army created by the CIA. And then they merged with the Turkish army, the SNA, and they ethnically cleansed Kurds from numerous northern parts of Syria, including Al-Bab, which is like an Arab, a majority, there were Arabs, of course, but there were a lot of Kurds in these northern parts of Syria. In fact, I'm going to get up now in northern parts of Syria that are under military occupation by Turkey. There are children that are being repopulated, these areas that had traditionally been Kurdish. They're repopulating the areas with Sunni Syrian Arabs, and they're brainwashing their kids to force them to learn Turkish and wave Turkish flags. I would highly recommend this great journalist, Lindsay Snell, who believed she kind of, like a lot of Western journalists, she thought, oh, there's like this great progressive revolution in Syria. I'm going to go there and check it out and report on it. And she was kidnapped by ISIS because the fake Free Syrian Army sold her out she was kidnapped by Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra. The fake Free Syrian Army backed by the CIA sold her out. They gave her information to Jabhat al-Nusra that kidnapped her and held her ransom as a journalist. And she's one of the best journalists reporting on kind of like Turkish neo-revanchism and like Turkish neo-Ottomanism and fascism. And she talks about how this extremist right-wing party in Turkey has a mayor who just visited a school in Al-Bab, Syria, which used to have a lot of Kurds in the northern part of Syria, which has been totally repopulated by Turkey. And you can see in these insane photos, these children, all of the girls are covered, these young girls are covered with hijabs, of course, and they have the young boys, and they're all holding the Turkish Grey Wolves, which is like this fascist Turkish group, which ironically actually had been cultivated by the CIA as the part of Operation Gladio. If there was ever a war with the Soviet Union, of course, Turkey, which is a NATO member, had U.S. nuclear weapons, but also what's lesser known is that if there was ever a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, the weapons in Turkey would be used, but also there were stay-behind networks of Turkish Grey Wolves who would fight against the Soviet Union, which was right on the doorstep at the time of the Soviet Union. So anyway, the U.S. has been encouraging all of this at the same time while they're supporting the Kurds. So it's clear that the U.S. doesn't care at all about the Kurds and about Kurdish self-determination. They're using the Kurds to try to weaken Syria and carve off a third of Syrian territory, which includes the oil and gas-rich regions. And the explicitly stated goal of the U.S. government under both Trump and Biden has been to starve the Syrian government of revenue it needs to rebuild. And there's one other thing I'll say here before concluding this answer. And there was this incredible policy paper that was written by one of these ghouls in one of these DC think tanks that's funded by the U.S. government. And I wrote an article about it. And you can see here in this photo, this U.S. armored vehicle right next to a YPG flag. I mean, it's so depressing, frankly, because a lot of people in the YPG did believe in the mission and their leaders just sold them out. It's similar to the Iraqi Kurdish leadership, which also sold out. And the Iraqi Kurdish leadership supported the Iraq War. The Iraqi Kurdish leadership under the Barzani, the Barzani mafia, the Barzanis are working closely with Israel, and I mean, they're totally reactionary. So, I mean, not to say that the Iraqi Kurdish leadership and the Syrian Kurdish leadership are the same. They have a lot of differences, but there's a history of Kurdish leadership selling out their struggle opportunistically on behalf of imperialism, just as there is for many other struggles. And anyway, the point is that in this article, I point out how there was a fellow at this think tank called the Center for New American Security, which is closely linked to the Democratic Party and closely linked to the Biden administration and the Obama administration. And he talked about how the SDF was a, quote, proxy. He openly referred to the SDF as a proxy, and he said that it should use the proxies to use wheat as a weapon in order to starve the Syrian civilian population, to, quote, apply pressure on the Assad regime and through the regime on Russia to force concessions. So this is what, I mean, it's pretty incredible. Like, look, I'm not in any way trying to downplay the horrors that Kurdish people, especially in Turkey, have gone through. But at the same time, like, we have to be realistic. You can't just, like, the people on the left can't pretend like the YPG is some revolutionary communist or anarchist or whatever they want to project onto it, some great revolutionary model. The reality is that if you listen to what these ghouls on K Street in Washington, D.C. are saying, they're explicitly saying that the SDF YPG are their proxies and that they're using them to starve the Syrian government and to prevent the Syrian government from retaking the 1/3 of territory in the northeast. Finally, here's this thing I mentioned, by the way. It was the Air Force Times, the Air Force Times, about how they're training members of the SDF to help call in airstrikes. And here it says, right here, this is, again, U.S. Air Force Times. The photos were released at part with deterrence in mind, and it names this guy Harras. Harras is the same think tanker who proposed using the SDF so-called proxies to starve the Syrian government of wheat, of its revenue. And Harras said, here you go, Russian and Syrian government leaders have long sought the U.S. military's exit from the northern part of the country, where U.S. troops work alongside their SDF proxies. This is the U.S. Air Force Times. So, at the very least, it shows the kind of colonial mentality that they have for the Kurdish forces in northern Syria.
Okay, since Stephen is having connection issues, I'm just going to read out his question there, and that'll be the last one if that's okay with you, Ben. Right, so the question is as follows. Ireland, despite having 800 years of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist history, we do have a lot of useful idiots on the left who are fully embedded in imperial intersectionality, postmodernism, liberalism, etc. To see what criticized for opposing the balkanization of China, for example. To what extent do you think the fake left today is just a result of liberal hegemony reproducing itself, or is it being controlled or bankrolled by the state security apparatus? Essentially, are people doing the CIA's work for them at this point?
Great question. I mean, I would say that it's a false dichotomy. It's a false question. It's the same thing. That is what it is. What produces liberal hegemony? What produces any ideological hegemony? So this gets back to the question of the base and the superstructure, right? The point is that ideology becomes hegemonic when it has class power. That's the point, right? And that's why I actually don't like Slavoj Žižek in a lot of ways. I think he's a reactionary in some ways, and especially on the issue of imperialism. I mean, and to talk about the fake left, I mean, this isn't to say that Slavoj Žižek has never done useful work. He's done some useful stuff, but going back even to Yugoslavia, Slavoj Žižek was actually part of the liberal anti-communist opposition against Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was also, by the way, was kind of like in between the Soviet Union and NATO. And ironically, of course, NATO went against it and destroyed Yugoslavia. But Yugoslavia was used as divide and conquer to try to weaken the socialist bloc by encouraging splits within the alliances. But anyway, the point is that, so that aside on Slavoj Žižek, I'm not saying I'm uncritically endorsing him, but that's why I actually think the only really good stuff he does is on cultural criticism, because he understands that most ideology is invisible. That's how ideological hegemony works, is that there's this famous quote, I want to get this up, it's so important, about how a CIA operative said that we'll know that we succeeded when everything that we say that's a lie, people believe. It was in a Ray McGovern article. Ray McGovern is a former CIA analyst who's one of the very few CIA whistleblowers in the history. I mean, the majority of people, they never really leave the CIA. They die CIA. But he actually became a whistleblower. And, all right, here we go. So we know this because of Ray McGovern. Sorry, I'm going to share my screen here. So former CIA analyst Ray McGovern recalled a statement made in 1981 by then CIA Director William Casey, by the way, who created the National Endowment for Democracy, during a meeting of Ronald Reagan's cabinet. Casey told the gathering, quote, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." That's based on a first-hand account. So this question, I think, is a good question, but it's also a false dichotomy. To what extent do you think the fake left today is a result of the liberal hegemony reproducing itself or being controlled or bankrolled by the state security apparatus? That's how liberal hegemony reproduces itself. Of course, there's a dialectical relationship, right? But the point is that materially, the way that this ideology reproduces itself is through the media, through culture, and when I say culture, I mean movies, TV shows. How many Netflix movies and TV shows have insane anti-communist propaganda all over? And it's often like side by side with like LGBTQ characters and women leads and people of color. That's exactly how liberal hegemony reproduces itself. And as, again, to get back to this Zizek thing, that's why I think that actually, even though I disagree with him on a lot of stuff, his series on The Pervert's Guide to Cinema is actually really smart, because he understands how much ideology is actually invisible and is embedded into culture and movies and music and TV show, and how like politics is discussed in like a day-to-day way, like not politics in like a deep politics way in terms of how class politics works and how the base and superstructure operate, but actually like in the way when people talk about day-to-day electoral politics, most of that is just superficial culture. And I'm a Democrat because I believe this. I'm a Republican because my dad was a Republican. I'm always going to vote Labor because my grandpa supported Labor. I'm a Tory because blah, blah, blah. And if you listen to the way people talk about it, it's in day-to-day politics, it's often not rooted in actual class politics. It's often based in culture, right? And that culture is a product of the liberal hegemony, which is itself materially reinforced by the intelligence agencies, by foundations, by large corporations, and by finance capital. So, I mean, what we're talking about today is how is one aspect, of course. There's so many other aspects, but as a journalist, I'm curious in how materially this is reinforced in the so-called left, and looking at where the money's coming from and just following the money, stupid, right? Because so much of the ideological instruction, it's not just done through the political parties themselves, but it's actually done through organized crime, through these intelligence agencies. And I'm convinced, I think it's a historical counterfactual, but I think if you go back to the first Cold War, and if it were not for this massive apparatus constructed, I think that socialism would have triumphed. I actually think it's one of the main reasons for the Sino-Soviet split. And that's not to take the fault off of the Soviet Union or of China. Both of them had major problems. The Soviet Union had a problem with chauvinism and Khrushchev revisionism, allying with US imperialism at first. And then the Maoist movement had a problem with ultra-leftism, which, by the way, just as much as like the old school Khrushchev revisionism was allowed, it was imperialists and the same apparatuses were able to weaponize that against the international communist movement. Later in the 1960s and 70s, Maoist ultra-leftism was also weaponized against the international communist movement. And we know that the CIA and the FBI did support some like Maoist false gangs, they call them, like these ultra-left Maoists, to like break up existing socialist movements and to claim that everyone that didn't believe in like armed struggle and people's war in the imperial core is a Khrushchev revisionist. So it goes both ways, of course. But the point I'm saying is that the Sino-Soviet split was also a product, the whole like revisionism, anti-revisionism, and all the contradictions with imperialism, leading ultimately, ironically, to the ultra-left side, to the Maoists actually allying with capitalist imperialism against what they called social imperialism, in the same way that the Trots became neoconservatives. I mean, there's actually a very interesting parallel there between, I mean, there are Maoists who had very good, consistent politics, but there were Maoists who were weaponized by the same apparatus and unwittingly became also tools of imperialism, especially after China. I mean, we're talking about criticism of China, especially after the Nixon visit to China, and then China allies with the US and supports Pinochet and supports the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia against the Vietnamese communists who were supported by the Soviet Union. And you can go down the list of so many different examples. So the point is that this liberal hegemony reproducing itself and this fake left, the process of this ideological construction that we're talking about is part and parcel not only of liberal hegemonic reproduction in the imperial core, but also I think played a key role in defeating the international communist movement in the First Cold War.
I want to thank Ben for his talk and for taking the time to speak to us today. It was very thorough. It touched on so many different kind of questions and different areas of thought. So really appreciate you taking the time and effort to speak to us. And also thanks to everyone who attended.
And thanks again for taking the time.
Thanks to
Thanks
you
a lot,
all.
Ben.
Keep in touch.
Appreciate it.